I'm Hollywood now. We went 11-1 last week. We've been on absolutely fire lately. Only fight we got wrong was the Jake Matthews fight, but to be fair, he was never a confident pick of mine. All the confident picks came through. All the underdog picks came through. Cam Ralston, Jamie Malarkey, Colby Thickneys. Take a look at these parlays I gave out on the best bets video. Clean sweep. The lock of the week comes through, which was Navajo Sterling. Underdog of the week comes through, which is Colby Thickneys. Cam Ralston and Jamie Malarkey come through. 11-1. It was truly a great week. So let's continue getting these picks right. Hope y'all are doing well. Welcome to this week's prediction episode for UFC 320, where I'll be breaking down and predicting every fight on the card. Let's dive in to the first fight of the night. First fight of the night, we got. Yo, before I start though, if you guys want the secret to like getting these picks right, you guys gotta try these out. If you have a Trader Joe's next to you where they sell these pomegranate juices, bro, I drink like 10 of these a day. They're so good. No ad though. These are just me trying to put y'all on, okay? First fight of the night, we got Veronica Hardy versus Brogan Walker. So my pick for this fight is going to be Veronica Hardy. I'm taking Veronica Hardy to win this fight. Brogan Walker, she's 0-2 in the UFC right now. She's really a low-level fighter. She has 0% takedown defense rate. 0% takedown accuracy is what I meant. She lost 4 out of her last 5 fights, and the fight she did win was to someone that's on a 6-fight losing streak right now. She hasn't fought in over 2 years. She only fights once a year when she does fight. And it really seems like she doesn't take fighting seriously at this stage in her career, or it looks like she never took fighting seriously. She's 36 years old now. I feel as though she has hit her ceiling. We're not going to see any big drastic change in her game. However, back in 2018, she got a win over Miranda Maverick, which has aged pretty well, right? It's aged pretty nicely. But in 2018, Miranda Maverick was only around 20 years old at the time and was still really green onto the scene, while Brogan was in her prime, basically, at around 30 years old. So I don't think we're going to see any improvements in Brogan's game here. She's been on a downhill slope at this stage in her career, while someone like Veronica, who's 29 years old, improving her game time and time again. She married Dan Hardy 3 years ago, excuse me, which has been so helpful for her. To have someone like Dan Hardy guiding her and coaching her throughout her journey. She's definitely improved since being married to him. Ever since she married to him, she put 3 straight wins together. But most recently, she just lost her last fight to Eduardo Mora, who's a great fighter. No shame in losing to Eduardo at all. And Eduardo looked humongous compared to Veronica in that matchup. She's a great counter striker, great wrestler. She's 12-1. Eduardo's really good. There won't be a huge size difference here. There will be a huge skill difference here, though. Veronica's footwork is going to be a problem in this matchup. Veronica has a strong striking background. She's quick, she's patient. She moves around the octagon nicely, and when she decides to strike, she's really fast with her strikes. She's active with her kicks, her leg kicks, body kicks, strikes nicely from the outside, and doesn't really chase or force shots. She usually is vulnerable to getting taken down, but even then, her grappling seems to be improving still. And fighting Brogan Walker, who isn't really too special anywhere, uh, she has 7 wins, and seven of them come by decision. She's not really excelling anywhere. Uh, she's primarily a striker, so she isn't going to be looking for takedowns here. And for the most part, which is even better for Veronica, because it allows her to work her game smoothly for Veronica, right? I see Veronica having effective striking and combinations. She will most likely outstrike Brogan, control the pace, manage distance, and utilize her jab throughout the fight. Brogan will most likely try to go for takedowns, but her takedown accuracy is 0%. She's not. She's going to have a hard time closing the distance, trying to touch Veronica or even get a hold of her. I just can't see her getting control of Veronica or hurting her whatsoever in this fight, you know? Veronica is going to be a mobile kickboxer, and her grappling is improving, and she has sharp distance control, and she's 29 and ascending in her career, while Brogan has low output, 0% UFC takedown accuracy. She's had a long layoff. She's 36, and she's kind of plateaued in this stage of her career. So I just think Veronica's going to be able to outpoint her clean and stay at range for the majority of this fight. Moving on to our next fight, we got Ramiz Brahimaj versus Austin Hubbard. I'm gonna go Ramiz Brahimov, but it's hard to get a read on Ramiz, He's been alternating wins and losses since 2018. He wins one, he loses the next. He wins one, he loses the next. It wasn't until his last fight where he was able to break that streak and finally put two wins in a row. A fight where he was a massive underdog as well, upsetting Billy Ray Goff, who I thought Billy Ray Goff would be able to outstrike him. But Billy Ray, he goes for a takedown and he gets caught in a guillotine. It was an impressive victory, which makes me feel like he's finally getting into his rhythm. But in his career, Ramiz has losses to Themba Gorimbo, Court McGee, Max Griffin. Like, these are not elite fighters whatsoever, So it makes me feel like he can lose on any given night. But throughout his career, he's been historically tough. He's never been knocked out other than the doctor stoppage to Max Griffin, where he nearly lost his ear. I'm not even sure if they were able to sew his ear back on. I'm not sure. But based off of his last two performances, he has two back-to-back finishes, one by knockout, one by submission, both in the first round. And I mean, he's looked good recently. He's 32 years old now. He's in his prime, and I mean, versus Mickey Gall, he actually looked really good there. He looked really fluid in his striking, was composed throughout the fight. He didn't stiffen up when he got hit. He stayed fluid. He looked sharp and powerful. And eventually he found the finish. And like I said, historically, he's been durable, right? And in his most recent fight, I actually thought Billy Ray would be able to outbox him in that fight, but Billy decides to be a wrestler and he gets submitted, right? So now fighting Austin Vanderford, who he had a great career in Bellator. He only lost twice in Bellator, but we know Bellator isn't the same level as the UFC. But now in the UFC, he won his UFC debut versus a low-level fighter, versus second round TKO, where he was able to secure takedowns on his opponent, and land ground and pound strikes before the referee steps in. There was nothing brutal in the shots that he was throwing in the ground and pound strikes, but it was enough to have the ref step in. Austin, he's primarily a grappler. He's looking to take you down. We've seen Ramiz get taken down multiple times and controlled in the fight with Court McGee that he had. So we know he's been vulnerable to being controlled from takedowns, but in his last fight, his takedown defense looked improved, right? And so I think based off of his most recent performances, I'm leaning with Ramiz here because his striking has been looking nice. His wrestling and takedown defense has looked nice recently. His durability has looked great his whole career. And Austin won his debut. He looked good there, but against low level competition, So both fighters, they have been inconsistent in their career, but Ramiz's inconsistency in his career has been to higher level competition, So I think Austin will have a hard time trying to get a hold of Ramiz. It'll be tough to take him down, and Ramiz can keep it on the feet, and on the feet, I see Ramiz being much more fluid, much more tough in the exchanges, and he can always snatch up a submission, wherever the fight goes. So if he's getting taken down or if he is on the ground, I do think Ramiz will be winning the striking exchanges for sure, and his grappling is good enough to dictate where this fight will be able to take place, right? And I think there's just levels to this game, and I don't think Austin has proven to be on the level as someone as experienced as Ramiz, right? So I think the durability is going to help out Ramiz here. He's going to be tough in the striking exchanges, and he has the the clinch experience and the grappling edge in this matchup to help him dictate where the fight goes. And I think he has good power. He's fluid on the feet, and he's very opportunistic when it comes to submissions. And his form has been looking good recently, right? And Austin, he's gonna be a wrestling first type of mindset, I feel, and he has average striking. His win in the UFC, it wasn't nothing special. It was a very it was against very soft competition, and I feel he needs to get control of Ramiz in this fight in order to have any success. And I think it's going to be a hard time for him to get control over Ramiz. You know, I think Ramiz is going to win the striking exchanges. He's going to be scrambling, and I think the club and sub is live here for Ramiz. You know, he can hit him with his power and possibly submit him when he gets Austin on the ground, right? Moving on to our next fight. Nikolay Veretennikov versus Punahele Soriano. I'm gonna go Punahele Soriano. So my thoughts on these two guys is that I think Punahele Soriano, he's low key a beast, right? Like as we saw in his last fight, if he lands the right shot, you're going down. You know, the fight's over. He carries some serious power when he lands, right? When he lands the right shots. And my thoughts on Nikolay is that I don't think I don't think he's beast. You know, I don't think he's a beast. You know, at all. You know, I don't like his mentality. Not like how he's definitely not a beast like Soriano. You know, I really don't like Nikolay's mentality. Right? Like, let me explain why. You know, we just talked about his fight with Austin Vanderford, where he took on Austin Vanderford in Austin's UFC debut, where he was on his back, you know, taking ground and pound shots to the head continuously, and the referee eventually steps in. Then Nikolay stands up complaining to the referee, right? Saying he's fine. Then he shoves Austin Vanderford after the fight instead of paying his respects. You know, then that created some controversy after the fight. And personally, I really did not like that because I'm not saying those shots were damaging enough to stop the fight, but he could have at least done something. You know, he could have moved, he could have switched positions, he could have fought back, but to just lay there and eat shots without moving, then complain afterwards about the referee stepping in, like, come on. I feel like he could have done more, you know, instead of just having the fight be stopped and then complain after. He wasn't really doing much. He was just laying down there. So that really made me dislike his mentality. Because look at the fight with Gene Silva and Diego Lopez in round one. You know, that's exactly what you need to do. That's exactly how you're supposed to move when you're being ground and pounded. Gene Silva was moving left, right, pushing him up against. He wasn't just laying there taking the shots. You know, he tried his absolute best to not get the fight stopped. He was doing enough. And Nikolay was just literally just laying there, taking shot to the head, and then he's going to get up and complain afterwards. You know, and in his whole career, even in his UFC, his 3 fights in the UFC, Nikolay, he hasn't really shown anything special in the UFC. You know, 3 fights in the UFC, 2 losses, 1 win, and that 1 win was by split decision. He lost one by split decision as well, and the other loss was by TKO. You know, some below average performances, and he's primarily a striker. You know, he has decent power, good grappling, while Soriano is a striker, you know, but mostly a power striker with devastating shots. And he has a wrestling background, you know, he has a powerful jab, a dangerous left hook, and he's not afraid to engage. You know, he's usually able to dictate the pace of the fight with his striking. You know, he's 32 years old right now, in his prime age, and fighting an out of prime Nikolay. I think he should be able to win this one. You know, I think there's going to be a massive difference in power for Soriano. You know, his shots are going to be the much more impactful in this matchup, and the danger of his strikes will allow him to control the pace of this fight. You know, he comes from a wrestling background, which is going to help him here even more, right? The striking exchanges might be competitive. You know, Nikolay might land some shots, but the power difference will definitely help Soriano in this matchup. So, you know, Nikolay, he is a decent technician on the feet, but he's really inconsistent, and he has questionable urgency off his back, you know. And coming off with Soriano, you know, big power, pressure boxing, wrestling background. I think he's more athletic as well. So I just think Soriano will be able to land the heavier shots and possibly get him out of here with a knockout shot. Moving on to our next fight, we got the long-awaited return of Patchy Mix versus Jakub Wiklacz. Wiklacz. My pick is going to be Patchy Mix for this fight. So I was one of the few who picked Mario Bautista to beat Patchy Mix. Still to this day, I'm confused how anyone thought Patchy Mix had a chance in that fight. Mario Bautista is actually really good, as everyone saw, and Patchy Mix has never looked insanely impressive against even lower tier competition. So still, to this day, I'm still confused about why Mario was the underdog in that fight. Fighting Mario in your debut is no joke, and I was never really a fan about what Patchy Mix has done outside of the UFC. He looked okay, but the level of competition isn't anything special. Nowhere near UFC level competition or high ranked UFC level competition. So I thought Mario would be able to win that fight. And he did, right? So Patchy Mix, he's mostly known for his submissions. Patchy has 13 wins by submission and only 2 wins by knockout. And Jakub Wiklacz, I don't know how you say it. He's also a submission specialist himself, 10 out of his 16 wins come by submission. And he's only ever been submitted once, and it was by heel hook in 2016, which was nearly 10 years ago, right? So it's not easy to submit Jakub because he's skilled on the ground as well. And I do think the level of competition they both have faced favors Patrick Mix. I think Bellator has higher level competition than KSW, which is where Jakub is fighting from, where he's coming from. And I think Patchy Mix is more proven in his career. I feel Patchy is coming into this fight with a chip on his shoulder after getting exposed in his last fight, and he seems really locked in for this fight. And I'm not saying he got exposed. I just think there was so much hype behind him, and not many people knew about the skills of Mario. So it looked like he got exposed, but really, Mario was always going to be the better fighter in that fight. And I don't see none of these guys, Jakub or Patchy, making a run for the title. They both seem pretty average when it comes to the highest level competition in the UFC. This fight really comes down to who can implement their game plan on the other guy. Both guys want to get control over the other guy. They both want top control, but simply put, I think Patchy Mix is more dangerous on the ground, and he has the better grappling. I feel like Jakub's striking game isn't good enough to dictate where this fight goes, and because using your striking can help you, uh, it can help implement the takedowns, right? But Jakub doesn't have the same high level striking that someone like Mario Bautista does, right? So Patchy is going to have an easier time implementing his own game plan, get this fight on the ground if he wants to. And I think his striking is good enough to compete with Jakub's, right? And I think Patchy will be able to get the takedowns here, showcase some dominant top control in this matchup versus Jakub. Excuse me. Uh, who Jakub isn't really on his level, in my opinion. Patchy could pressure him on the feet, change levels, and avoid any submissions from Jakub, who I haven't really been too impressed by in his career. So I think Jakub is going to be a safe pick here because, you know, oh no, I think Patchy is going to be a safe pick here, right? Because I think he has elite back takes, 13 subs on his record. He has a stronger resume. He's coming into this fight with a chip on his shoulder. While Jakub, he has crafty trips and he has good top game. He has solid submission defense, but it's been a lesser strength of schedule. I think Patchy's going to be able to grapple and control Jakub, and I think he's going to be able to edge this one out via decision or possibly find the choke here. You know. So moving on to our next fight of the night, we got Macy Chiasson versus Yana Santos. I'm picking Macy Chiasson to win this fight. So Macy, she's a pretty good striker. She is really long and tall for the division. Moves around the octagon nicely. She has nice striking. She was vulnerable to getting taken down in her last fight, which is pretty much what costed her the fight. She's a UFC veteran fighting another UFC veteran in Yana Santos, who's primarily a striker as well. A pretty good striker. Although she has lost by knockout TKO 3 times in the UFC, both ladies here, they are tough and durable, and not durable. They're both tough and gritty. I feel both of these fighters have here, they're primarily strikers. Macy being so tall and long, she's going to want to use her length and reach to pressure Yana Santos in this matchup. Yana is going to try to counter her. Um, she's going to try to counter her shots on the feet, but they've both shown uh, to be able to land takedowns when they need to. In her second to last fight, Macy was able to secure a crucial takedown on Mayra Santos and landed nasty elbows that cut open her face, which led to a doctor stoppage. It was kind of back and forth competitive fight up until she landed that crucial takedown, which was able to win her that fight. And in 2022, when Macy fought Norma Dumont, Macy landed 6 takedowns on her and won the fight, which is pretty impressive considering how good Normal Dumont is, how well that win has aged, right? And Yana has had her moments in getting takedowns as well, but I do think um, she isn't as comfortable as Macy when it comes to actually going for takedowns. I think Macy is more of a complete fighter. She can mix it up. She can mix up her game more fluidly in times where she needs to adapt to the fight. She knows how to use her length and reach advantage during the striking. I think Macy will have enough pressure and volume on the feet to win this fight, and that can allow her to change levels as well. I can see Yana throwing a lot of kicks in this matchup to deal with a long striker like Macy in order to close the distance. But I still think Macy will be landing the better shots throughout the fight. Because she has good pressure and she knows how to use her length to her advantage. She's tall, a rangy striker, and she can mix in takedowns fluidly. And I think she's going to be able to be the better minute winner here. She's going to be able to win more minutes throughout this fight. And Yana, she's going to come in, kick heavy in this matchup, but she's hittable, and she can somewhat take care of herself in the grappling. I just think Macy is going to be winning as the fight goes on, because Yana might start to fade under pressure, as the fight goes on. So I think the volume from Macy and mixing in the clinch positions and the takedowns is going to win her this fight via decision, right? So moving on to our next fight. Daniel Santos versus Ju Sang Yu. I'm so excited for this one. I'm going Ju Sang Yu to win this fight. I try my best to never look at the odds before any fight breakdown so that I'm not influenced by the numbers. But I ended up seeing the odds for this fight in particular, and truly they blew me away, because I thought Ju Sang Yu would be at least a minus 250 favorite or something like that. That's a little crazy, but I thought he would be the favorite at least. This fight is basically a pick'em odds, and Ju Sang Yu is on the underdog side of this fight, which blew my mind. But I think Ju Sang Yu, he has what it takes to dominate this fight. I think the odds are close because Ju Sang Yu, he might get taken down here and he won't be able to implement his striking. But from what I've seen, his takedown defense is really solid. Before Ju Sang Yu entered the UFC, I was trying to tell everyone, this guy is going to be a problem in the UFC here. The things he was doing outside the UFC, I mean, the level of striking he has, it had me mesmerized. He comes into the UFC, he gets an easy first round knockout, like a slip left hook, kind of like Conor McGregor, like prime Conor McGregor, right? And then Ju Sang Yu, before the UFC, you know, you can just look at him and you can tell this guy's the truth. This guy is actually a sick fighter. He has insane striking, very smart fighter. He knows how to break you down. He's very sharp and fluid with his technique. He has great elbows in the clinch, great takedown defense, very calm under pressure, amazing distance management, great head kicks, great spinning back kicks, amazing footwork. Like, he looks like he's the full package, right? He's coming off of back-to-back first-round knockouts. He's obviously still undefeated. He's been to the decision 4 times already, so we know he can go all 3 rounds. He has the cardio. In the third round of one of his fights, it looked like the fight hasn't even started for him in the third round while his opponent was gasping for air. Undefeated, of course. He also has a really sick back tattoo as well. I've seen videos of Max Holloway praising this guy, saying he will be fighting guys in the top 15 of the division. And I'm taking Max Holloway's word for it because I feel the same way. Daniel Santos, yes, he has 3 wins in a row now in the UFC. He also lost his UFC debut. But he's fast. He's active with his kicks. He's smart enough to go for takedowns when the striking isn't favoring him. And that's really the biggest threat here for Ju Sang Yu. If Daniel Santos can get those takedowns going, if he can get those takedowns going and be able to control Sang Yu here, he definitely has a path to victory. But in his last fight, Daniel Santos gets dropped early. He got dropped early in the first round. His opponent was able to time a nice right hand down the middle. And one thing about Ju Sang Yu is that his timing is elite, right? But then in that fight in Daniel Santos's last fight, Santos started to use the grappling to slow the pace down, get the fight where he wanted it to be. But for the most part, Santos is going to keep it on the feet and try to strike. That's just the type of fighter he is. Unless the striking isn't going into his favor, then he'll try to mix in the grappling. But he's going to want to play the striking game first. I just don't think he's going to be able to find success against someone like Ju Sang Yu, which will then make him want to grapple in this matchup. And I think Ju Sang Yu will be measured in his strikes. He's not going to overcommit and leave himself vulnerable for counters or getting taken down. And I think he's going to have Santos chasing him and countering him with some slick shots like he always does, because Santos is primarily a striker. And I think if Santos goes for takedowns, it won't be without eating some damaging shots first. Sang Yu is a really smart fighter. He has great boxing, great defense, great distance management, and solid takedown defense. So it's going to be hard to close that distance on him and actually get those takedowns going, especially if you're primarily a striker first. He's going to time something and it's going to catch Daniel Santos. So I see Ju Sang Yu maintaining the striking distance. He'll be longer and taller guy. I see him utilizing his footwork, staying safe and avoiding the takedowns. Santos is going to have to pressure forward. He has this pressure forward style, but I see that costing him here in a matchup like this. He'll definitely shoot for takedowns, but I think that the majority of the fight will take place on the feet where he's getting picked apart. So I just think on his way to closing that distance, he's going to get hit, and if he doesn't get put away from the shots he eats from Ju Sang Yu, he's going to be compromised enough so that the rest of the fight, he's going to be not the same for the rest of the fight. As soon as Ju Sang Yu times something, he's already going to be building on that momentum. So if he doesn't put Daniel Santos away with his shots, he's going to land the more damaging shots and he's going to have the upper hand after the fight, throughout the whole fight. You know what I mean? So I just think that, yeah, Santos, he's an aggressive kicker and he will shoot if he's losing minutes, but after eating those shots, like, he's gonna have a hard time even shooting when he's hurt, right? And because Ju Sang Yu, he's slick, he's a measured sniper. He has A+ distance management and he has good takedown defense and his timing is really precise. So I think for the most part of this fight, Ju Sang Yu is going to be able to pick him apart and stuff enough shots to win him the minutes of this fight. Moving on to our next fight, we got Chris Gutierrez versus Farid Basharat. I gotta go Farid Basharat in this fight. I feel like Chris Gutierrez, he's decent. He's definitely a decent fighter, but he hasn't quite been able. He hasn't quite been able to reach that top level of his game in the UFC. He has 10 wins in the UFC, and as impressive as that is, none of those wins truly stand out. 3 of those wins came by split decision, so it's not like he's dominating these matchups. He had a draw with Cody Durden, lost to Pedro Munoz and Song Yadong. These guys are actually decent. And so anytime he comes up against someone ranked or close to the top 15, he doesn't pull through. And even against average level competition, he's winning split decisions and he's drawing to Cody Durden. And he does have a win over Frankie Edgar, but Frankie isn't the same guy he used to be, right? So it's not like that even stands out. And compared to Farid Basharat, who's coming off of a great win to over Victor Hugo, and has a win over Damon Blackshear. These are wins that are close to the competition that Gutierrez is beating, and he's winning fights pretty convincingly, and more convincingly than Chris Gutierrez is winning his fights. When it comes to this level of competition, what I mean. So Farid is winning his fights decisively. He seems like a promising contender, and I can see him getting ranked in this division. So with that being said, I don't think Chris is going to be able to hang with him here, because Chris has trouble with these types of guys. These guys that are have momentum coming into the UFC. You know what I mean? Anytime Chris faces someone that has real promise as a prospect, he tends to fold. And I see Farid climbing the ranks and winning more fights after this one. And I think he's on a much higher level than someone like Chris Gutierrez is. And that's saying something, because Chris is actually a great fighter. He has solid stand-up game, thudding leg kicks, great get-up game when he is taken down, and he knows how to stick and move. Doesn't really chase or overextends. He avoids damage really well. And I mean, he's not an easy fight for anyone. He's really calculated and technical and calm and patient in his striking. His leg kicks, his range movement, his takedown defense. The guy is really good, but in his most recent loss to Song Yadong, we saw Song be able to slow the pace down and match the rhythm of that fight that Chris usually brings to the fight. And I mean, Chris had really no answer for Song Yadong. And Farid Basharat, man, his stand-up game is legit. It's pretty similar to Chris's striking, but I feel he does it at a much higher level in terms of his speed, his reaction time, his versatility, the timing in his shots, the thud in his shots, the distance management. I think power for power, it might be close. I'm not saying Farid has more powerful shots in him, but I think Farid is going to be the much quicker and smarter guy in there. And Farid's defense, it's really nice to watch. His reaction time, it's like a cat. He moves in and out and snipes you. And he moves out the way really nicely. He's comfortable switching levels and shooting for takedowns, which is something you like to see. He really sets the tone when he fights. He makes fighters fight at their own pace, pushing a high pace. He's athletic, he's smart, and I feel he's much better than the guys that Chris has lost to, right? And like Chris is losing to Pedro Munoz, and I think Farid is going. If Chris is losing to Pedro Munoz, then I think Farid is going to be able to eat him up, because Farid's the type of fighter that Chris struggles with, right? And I think Chris is going to have a hard time gauging distance in this fight. He won't have an easy time timing those leg kicks that Chris likes to throw. And I feel the relentless pace and pressure of Farid is going to be so difficult to deal with in this matchup. Along with Farid's ability to mix in takedowns, I think his defense is sharp enough to avoid Chris's best shots and win more exchanges throughout the fight. So I do like Chris though. He's a crafty kicker. He's tough to hold down, and the thing is he struggles versus higher ceiling guys, and I think Farid definitely has a higher ceiling than a lot of people in this division, and he's gonna be faster than Chris. He has a more variety in his strikes. He mixes levels well, and he's able to dictate the pace. He slows the pace down with his pressure. He kind of sets the tone in his fights, with his relentless pace. And he's able to fight to his own rhythm. He's going to dictate the pace. He's going to be cleaner. And he's going to be the quicker fighter throughout all 3 rounds in this matchup, right? So I see Farid winning this one pretty decisively. Moving on to our next fight, Edmen Shahbazyan versus Andre Muniz. This was a tough pick, but I'm gonna go with Andre Muniz. I have him listed as 55 years old. I don't know why I did that. He's 35 years old. He's not 55. It's kind of funny. But listen to this breakdown fully, because it'll start to make sense the more I talk towards the end of the breakdown. But I'm going to go with Andre Muniz. So Edmen, he used to be kind of a reckless fighter. He used to come in and look for damaging shots, on his opponents. He used to stay in the pocket longer than he was supposed to, which caused him to eat a lot of shots while looking to land his own. Excuse me. But more recently, he's been a lot more patient and calculated. He doesn't rush or try to bulldoze his way in so carelessly trying to find a knockout. He's been a lot more patient nowadays, and he's always had some powerful shots when he throws, powerful kicks to the body, to the head. He's mostly a pressure forward type of fighter, which can still cost him by getting countered, but he's been improving and he's been putting some wins together, right? He's won 3 out of his last 4 fights, and in that fight he lost. It was to GM3. But he was pretty much destroying GM3 up until he got taken down and submitted. But in his most recent fight, he showed great takedown defense versus Andre Petroski, kept the fight on the feet, was calculated and patient in his strikes, landed some nice shots throughout the fight, controlled the center of the octagon, and landed some quick jabs. But that win over Andre Petroski, hasn't really aged the greatest. He just got knocked out in the first round last weekend. And early in his career for Edmen, he took some losses in his UFC career, but he was only around 22 years old, fighting top level fighters, and now still super young at 27, learning more and improving at his game. I think he has enough experience to handle these guys who aren't top level. And I wouldn't say Andre Muniz is a really high level fighter. Edmen, he could beat him, but Muniz is pretty decent. It wouldn't be crazy to say that he's around the same level of a fighter that Edmen is. The thing about Edmen is that, the thing about Muniz, is that he's going to have a similar game plan to Andre Petroski, trying to get this fight on the ground. But Muniz is not bad on the feet at all. I think Muniz is a better grappler than Petroski, so we might see Muniz have some success there. I think Muniz's striking is good enough to compete with Edmen, and that's what is going to allow him to mix in the takedowns. I think his maturity as a fighter for Muniz is going to help him out a lot here. Remember how I said GM3 was able to take down Edmen and then submit him? Look, the thing about Muniz is that he's 35 years old. We've seen everything he has to offer. He's lost 3 out of his last 4 fights. But take a look at those last 4 fights. His most recent one, he got knocked out early by Ikram, right? A decently high-level fighter. Before that, he beats Jung Young Park, controlling the fight on the ground. Then to Paul Craig, it was competitive on the feet. Competitive fight overall. Paul Craig was able to take him down, control him, and elbow him until the referee steps in. And the fight before that, it was Brendan Allen, who's a great grappler. Allen also took him down before having a competitive fight on the feet. The point is, Edmen isn't going to take him down like Paul Craig and Brendan Allen did. So if Edmen doesn't knock out Muniz in the first round like Ikram did, the striking exchanges are going to be competitive, and I believe Muniz definitely has the grappling advantage here. Muniz is losing to guys that take him down while having competitive fights on the feet. Of course, not his most recent one to Ikram, where he got knocked out. But if Muniz can manage to get some takedowns going, he can pretty much find the submission like GM3 did to Edmen, right? I feel people are sleeping on the striking skills of Andre Muniz, and I think his striking will allow him to mix in those takedowns and get control of Edmen. Because other than the guys who were able to take him down, Muniz has looked perfect, other than getting caught early in his last fight, So if Edmen isn't going to take him down or catch him early in this fight, Muniz is going to be very live to win this fight here. So, Edmen, I would say he's more cleaner in the striking. He's more patient with his boxing and kicks lately. He has strong takedown defense versus average wrestlers like Prochazka recently, but he was getting taken down by GM3 and submitted. And Muniz, he's losing to grapplers, and his best path to victory here is with his own grappling. He has usable striking. He's 35, and it's really been the grappling in his UFC career that has held him back, getting taken down. And I don't think Edmen is going to capitalize on that. So I think Muniz's grappling is going to help him win this fight if he is able to get the entries. He has a live submission game, and I think he is going to be able to control Edmen in this fight. So moving on from the 55-year-old Andre Muniz, he's 35. We are going to break down Ateba Gutierrez Osman Diaz. I don't even want to break this fight down. I'm gonna go with Ateba Gutierrez. This is going to be a mauling. At 6'4", athletic freak of nature, fighting someone that looks like he accidentally walked into the octagon while trying to find the hot dog stand in the stadium. Compared to Ateba, Ozzy is completely out of shape physically and athletically. And I mean, the skill difference here is going to be very evident. We had questions about Ateba's power when he fought Jose Medina. We were all saying, oh, Jose Medina got whooped for 3 rounds by Zachary Reese, and Jose has an iron chin. No one can knock out Jose. Ateba knocks him out in 1 round, right? Then in his next fight, Ateba knocks out Robert Valentin in 1 minute, and it was flawless. It was an astounding performance. I mean, his timing and skills were truly displayed there. It was just accurate shot after accurate shot. Like, this guy Ateba is really the Terminator. And I think when it comes to these average level competitors, they're toast coming up against him, and Ozzy Diaz is nothing special. He got knocked out by Joe Pyfer, another heavy hitter like Ateba in the Contender Series. Then they call Osman Diaz in to fight Min Young Zhang, and then gets knocked out there as well. And then they give him another shot in the UFC, which in his most recent fight, yeah, he won, but against someone making their debut. The opponent wasn't very good, but still was still getting touched up as well in that fight. Someone with the power and accuracy of a Teba touching you like that, young, youthful, hungry, determined. Osman is getting put to sleep again. I mean, we've seen this matchup stylistically before. Ozzy Diaz fights a powerful, sharp striker like Joe Pyfer. He gets knocked out. He fights another sharp, accurate, powerful striker like Min Young Zhang. He gets TKO'd. This guy Ateba, he's the next generation of sharp, accurate, powerful strikers, and it would be a miracle if Ozzy Diaz survives even the first round. Ateba has looked so sharp in his last fight against a somewhat decent striker, a better striker than Ozzy Diaz, that's for sure. And Ateba took care of him with ease. So he should be able to do the same here in an even quicker time. Ozzy is going to have to weather a heavy storm. Ozzy's going to have to weather a heavy early storm and try to make it past the first round, then try to work his way into the fight, try to land some powerful shots to gain respect early. But all it takes is one for Ateba, to completely change the fight. His technical striking, his precision, his youth mixed in with his determination. I mean, even his takedown defense, it's all super solid. That has to be one of the easiest calls on the entire fight card, for Ateba. Ateba to win by knockout, it will happen. He's 6'4", athletic, precise power, sharp shot selection, strong takedown defense. And Osman has really poor striking defense, been KO'd by similar hitters like Ateba many times before, and his tools are really limited in his arsenal, So Ateba Gutierrez knockout round 1, it's guaranteed, right? Moving on to our next fight. We got Joe Pyfer versus Abus Magomedov. I gotta go with Joe Pyfer in this matchup. I think Joe has a great team behind him. We were just speaking of Joe Pyfer. I think Joe has a great team behind him. He's working with high level guys like Sean Brady. I mean, obviously he has a ton of power in his shots. That's pretty much what he's known for, right? He's 6 years younger than Abus. It's going to be 29 years old versus 35 years old. One fighter is coming into their prime and one fighter is coming out of their prime. And Joe has been on a tear in the UFC. Of course, there was the fight with Jack Hermanson where Joe pretty much beat him up for the first half of the fight. He gasses out, then gets bullied for the rest of the fight. Other than that, he's looked great. Right, he was on a 5-fight finishing streak before the Jack Hermanson fight. Then he realized, he'll get to a certain level where he's not going to be able to knock out everyone, So he became a lot more measured in after that fight. He took it as a lesson and learned to become more measured in his striking. And still, right after that fight, he gets a first round knockout over Marc Andre Barrios. These are impressive performances time and time again. With his most recent fight with Kelvin Gastelum, I thought he played it smart. He played it the way he was supposed to. Everyone knows Kelvin has a block head. No one can knock Kelvin out. And Joe was able to land the strong, stinging shots without forcing a finish. He dropped Kelvin early in the first round and continued to land nice shots in the second round. And I wouldn't say Joe gassed out in the third round, but he definitely wasn't pushing the pace like he did in the first two, right? And that shows, he really did learn from the Jack Hermanson loss to the point where he wasn't able to get completely dominated in the third round, but he did slow down just a tiny bit. If this fight here was 5 rounds, then maybe I would consider Abus Magomedov, but I feel like it's no question who's going to land the more convincing shots. When Joe throws and lands, it's the story of the fight. Abus himself, he isn't a bad fighter. But stylistically here, Joe Pyfer is a bad matchup for anyone. Abus isn't a bad fighter though. His only losses here in the UFC are to Caio Borralho and Sean Strickland, some top level guys. But his wins, they're not too impressive. He beat Michel Pereira, but Michel Pereira, he looked so timid in that fight with Abus, and Michel just got knocked out by Kyle Dawkins, which isn't a good look at all, right? So that win over Michel, it's nothing too special. But before that, he was able to beat Bruno Ferreira by submission. But in that fight, Abus was eating some shots. Abus was badly hurt on multiple occasions in that fight. It wasn't until he ducked under a spinning back fist and secured a takedown in order to find the submission. And the thing is, if that's Joe Pyfer landing those shots on you, you might not be able to recover. And on top of that, Joe Pyfer's ground game, I would say it's underrated. Many people know him for his powerful shots on the feet, but this guy is a complete fighter. He has an impressive submission win over himself over what's his name, Abdul Razak Al Hassan. And in his fight with Kelvin, he took Kelvin down very briefly. It was only for a moment, but he was still changing levels. And I think the ability for Joe to keep this fight on the feet is going to be the deciding factor for why he wins this fight. Because in the stand-up, I know Joe has more pop in his shots. And even in the wrestling, I believe Joe has good enough wrestling to keep it on the feet or dictate where this fight goes. And I can see Joe landing heavy shots early in this fight. Maybe even drop him and land some ground and pound. Put enough pressure and a good enough pace to win the first 2 rounds at least, or even get a knockout within those 2 rounds. I can see Abus going for takedowns, but not having much success in doing so. He's going to weather a heavy storm early in the first round, and if he does survive that storm, I see him being compromised for the rest of this fight. But maybe possibly be able to win the third round, but that's about it. So I just think the nuclear hands from Joe Pyfer, it's going to play a big factor in this fight. Plus, he's had a much calmer pace ever since the Jack Hermanson fight, and I do think his wrestling is underrated. I do think he's a real complete fighter. And Abus, he's going to have to weather an early storm for the first 2 rounds, right? And he has defensive gaps. He's known for getting hit, or we've seen him get hit multiple times. His striking defense hasn't looked too great, and I can see Joe putting enough damage in the first 2 rounds to win him this fight. He's gonna be landing the bigger moments, so it's either gonna be a early knockout or a 29-28 Joe Pyfer, right? So moving on to our next fight, we got Josh Emmett versus Youssef Zalal. I gotta go Youssef Zalal here. I'm going Youssef Zalal. Josh Emmett is 40 years old. He really didn't do much in his last fight versus Leroy Murphy. Murphy is a top level talent in the division, but Emmett was frustrated in that fight for the most part. He was chasing Murphy, struggling heavy with the footwork of Murphy. He couldn't get into his rhythm, getting hit from different angles, and couldn't really land anything too significant. The movement and footwork was working really well for Murphy, and I feel Yusuf Zalal can replicate that same game plan. Zalal pretty much just replicated that same game plan against Calvin Kattar. Excuse me. Who's also a heavy hitter. He frustrated Calvin with his own footwork, mixed up his striking really nicely, and just like Murphy did to Emmett, right? And I think Zalal can do the same thing to Emmett because we've seen him do that same game plan versus Kattar. Plus Zalal himself, he's just been on a tear lately. His second run in the UFC has been so impressive. Um, Finishing fight after fight, getting past a UFC veteran in his most recent fight. I think his elusive style will help him out a ton here. He's a smart fighter. He doesn't get into any brawls, never stays stationary for too long, doesn't stay in the pocket for longer than he should. He sticks and moves. And that's the exact game plan you need when facing a heavy hitter like Josh Emmett. So Zalal's going to be significantly taller, taller, longer, younger, more agile, more athletic. It's hard to see him getting caught from Emmett's power. And I mean, Zalal went to a decision with Ilya Topuria. That just shows how good he is. But to be fair, Josh Emmett went to a decision with Topuria as well. But Emmett got brutalized in that fight with Topuria. Like Emmett looked like he lost half of his face at the end of the fight. It was a bad sight. And at the end of Topuria's fight with Zalal, Zalal looked like he didn't even get hit once in that fight because that fight was mostly Ilya going for takedowns. But with Emmett, Topuria was able to land with ease. So that just shows Zalal has a high level of footwork. It's hard to land on him, and now at 40 years old, I see it being so difficult for Emmett to get his game going. Zalal has good enough takedown defense to keep this fight on the feet. Stick and move. I can see Zalal just picking him apart from a distance, using his footwork to avoid the big power shots. And Yusuf can even take him down if he wants to. Josh Emmett's game plan is it's just way too obvious at this point. Everyone knows he's trying to land the big, powerful right hand, and Zalal's going to see it coming all night long. He'll be cautious all night long. I doubt he'll ever land anything significant or be able to get his game going. I just think Zalal is too young and slick and well-rounded to lose to Josh Emmett, who's 40 years old. He's a one-shot threat, and he struggles with guys with decent footwork, and that's something Zalal has, decent footwork, activity. He has the youth, the length, and his form lately has looked really improved. He looks like a top level contender. So I just see Zalal sticking and moving to win a decision here. Moving on to our next fight. Yuri Prochazka versus Khalil Rountree. I'm gonna go Yuri Prochazka to win this fight. I picked Khalil Rountree to win his last fight versus Jamal Hill. Personally, I never really liked Jamal Hill as a fighter. I picked Yuri Prochazka to beat Jamal Hill as well when Yuri was the underdog, which was pretty insane to me. I had no idea why Jamal Hill was the favorite over Yuri. So Yuri and Khalil, I feel they are good fighters. I just think Yuri might be a tad bit better. His only losses in the last 10 years have been to Alex Pereira in a fight which was mostly a kickboxing battle. Alex Pereira is currently one of the greatest kickboxers on the planet right now, him and Ankalaev, but we'll talk about them later. So only having lost to Alex Pereira, that's not a big deal, really. He's still a great fighter, and the way he dismantled Jamal Hill, I mean, I saw that coming, but he really shined in that fight. His instincts were on fire. His head movement, his ability to see the shots coming, create an angle and counter his shots. It was like a flawless victory, pretty much, for Yuri. At the same time, Khalil had a great performance against Jamal Hill as well. He dropped Jamal twice and pretty much won the fight dominantly, right? The thing about Khalil that's really scary, it's his leg kicks. He uses them so well. He's usually much shorter than a lot of guys, so closing that distance with his punches isn't easy for him. But because he's so much shorter and wider, he has that muscular frame, and his legs are like tree trunks, and they really play a big factor in most of his fights, especially his oblique kick. The one he throws from a sideways angle onto your knee, those are really gruesome. We saw him land that on Modestas Bukauskas, and he popped his knee right out of place, and it was a nasty sight. And because of those leg kicks taking such a big part in that fight, in his fights, that's what allows him to mix in those power punches. Because when he hit Jamal with those kicks, he became a stationary target. He was worried so much about those leg kicks that he wasn't able to go anywhere, with those leg kicks that were really compromised, which made it so much easier for Rountree to land his punches, get his punches going. It was a smart, calculated, and patient striking strategy from Rountree. He controlled the range, was defensively sound, and used a high fight IQ. But Yuri is a tough dude. If you don't knock him out, he's still coming forward no matter what. In his fight with Alexander Rakic, everyone was saying, oh, Alexander has terrifying leg kicks, and he does, he does have some really good leg kicks. Yuri got hit with a good amount of those leg kicks in the first round, but Yuri continued to press forward. He switched stances when he needed to, fought well in both stances, and in the second round comes out and drops Alexander Rakic, right? And against a guy like Khalil, I feel the constant pressure, never going away, even after you hit him with some good powerful leg kicks. That is not going to be easy for Khalil to deal with. The fight with Alex Pereira and Khalil Rountree in round 4, I think it was, when Alex was in that matrix mode and he was moving in and out so effortlessly, landing the nastiest shots on Khalil, seeing all Khalil's shots coming, evading them, then continuing to land punches, uppercuts, and hooks, and until Khalil just drops. I have a feeling we might see something similar to that, because Yuri has that come forward style. He knows how to evade shots as well. Definitely not as good as Alex Pereira, because Alex Pereira was just flawless in the moments of finishing Khalil. But Yuri might have a similar scenario where he's walking him down, landing shots. But I do think he will be getting hit with some shots coming back as well. But I don't think Khalil is going to be able to knock out Yuri. Yuri has pretty decent chin. He did get knocked out by Alex Pereira twice, but Alex has like the death touch. And if you look at the competitors that Khalil gets knockouts on, like if you see who Khalil is knocking out, they're pretty low level competitors, And I do think this fight is going to be a war for the most part. Both guys are going to be landing, but I think Yuri is just going to be landing to the face more consistently and more accurately. He will definitely eat some shots on the way in, closing the distance. But I think he'll be okay, And as the fight goes on, his shots will begin to have more of an effect on Khalil after landing more than being landed on, right? Plus, we saw in his last fight, Yuri was able to slip and counter. His ability to slip and counter is at a high level, so he might not get hit. He might not get hit. He might not get hit as much as we think. I think I just had a stroke there, but it was against Jamal Hill where he looked flawless, and I never really rated Jamal Hill to be a great fighter. He was overextending way too much in that fight, but still, that constant pressure forward style that Yuri has, along with his ability to mix in his head movement, I think he'll be able to take the leg kicks. I think he'll be able to take the leg kicks, pressure forward. He'll still be able to pressure forward, right? Land the shots, today's Khalil, and start making his movements seem. He'll start making Khalil's movements seem too predictable to the point where Yuri just starts teeing off on Khalil because he'll see all the shots coming. Yuri can be so unpredictable with his strikes while maintaining an aggressive fight style. He has a Muay Thai background, but still, Yuri does get hit sometimes. I just think he's a lot more unorthodox with his strikes, and he will be able to predict Khalil's movements more often than not. Khalil, he also has a Muay Thai background with some decent power in his shots. And of course, his leg kicks are going to play a big factor here in this fight. But I think Yuri is going to be way too chaotic in there, utilize his forward pressure, be unpredictable, land more than he gets hit, The leg kicks will definitely take a toll on Yuri, but I think he'll still be able to close the distance and outland Khalil. So I just think the relentless pressure, the creative counters, the durability from Yuri is going to help him here. The stance switches is going to play a big part when he starts getting hit with those leg kicks, and Yuri can fight out of both stances. Khalil does have some nasty calf and oblique kicks. He has patient power, but he needs a stationary target in order to find success, and Yuri is moving in and out in a very chaotic manner, still pressing forward even when he's compromised. And I think the chaos is going to favor Yuri in this matchup. He's going to rally through the kicks and outlands here as the fight goes on. He's going to be landing the more better shots, landing more than he does get hit. Moving on to our next fight. Merab Dvalishvili versus Cory Sandhagen. I'm going Merab Dvalishvili to win this fight. I'm definitely going Merab to win this fight. Merab, he has a 13 fight win streak in the UFC. Some seriously impressive performances. Most notably, his last 6 fights, he beat Jose Aldo, Peter Yan, Henry Cejudo, Sean O'Malley, Umar Nurmagomedov, Sean O'Malley again. These guys are the elite of the division. Those are not just some scrubs. Those are guys who are considered to be the highest level of fighters this division has to offer. And not a single one of them was able to beat Merab. And the guy is getting better. He just became the first person to submit Sean O'Malley. His cardio is unfathomable. The guy never looks tired. It looks like he can fight another 10 rounds if he has to. He's never seen to be breathing heavily. He never stops coming forward. As the fight goes on, he just continues to just break your will to fight. It's not like he's just scraping by these wins. He's beating these guys convincingly. You can't really make the argument that he's robbing any of these fights. He's clearly coming out on top against the highest level of competition this division has to offer. And now steps in Cory Sandhagen, who lost to Umar and Peter Yan, 2 guys that Merab beat, and also lost to Merab's teammate Aljo. Like, come on, there are levels to this game, and Merab is the final boss of the levels. When you look at Cory's record most recently, it kind of just shows that he isn't able to compete with the elite of the division. When you look at who he has lost to, Umar, Peter Yan, TJ Dillashaw, and Aljo, all 4 of those guys were former champions. The 2 former champions that Cory actually did beat was a very old man, Frankie Edgar, and old man Davison Figueiredo. Other than that, he's beating Rob Font, Marlon Vera, Song Yadong. Like, these are good wins, but these aren't championship level wins. These aren't championship level fighters. Cory is a really good contender, but Merab is just a different level. Cory has shown to fold under that elite level of competition, and now coming up against the champion of all the elites, this is not going to be easy whatsoever. There's nothing in Cory's career that has happened to lead me to believe that he can win this fight. In fact, most of everything that has happened in both of their careers lead me to believe that Cory really doesn't stand a chance to win here. Merab beats everyone, and Cory has struggled with guys that Merab made look like easy work, And every fight is stylistically different, of course, but the things that we've seen from Merab, his ability to adapt to anyone's game plan, his ability to adapt to all these different styles these contenders are giving him, he is truly a style bender. Like, he's truly the real style bender, because his approach to the game, it's difficult for everyone. That elite level cardio, the ability to ragdoll you for 25 minutes and not even get tired. He's like a mini Chimaev, right? Cory has some great striking, really technical, creative, unpredictable, but I still think Sean O'Malley has much better striking than Cory. O'Malley probably has the best striking in the division, right? And Merab took care of that, not once but twice. And O'Malley was saying all types of excuses in the first fight, so I thought, okay, maybe the second fight will be different. We'll see what happens. It ended quicker than the first fight. right? So it goes to show, high level striking isn't going to cut it here. You can have all the best timing in the world, the best footwork, the best accuracy, being unpredictable. It's great, but it's not enough. Uh, what Cory will need to do in this fight is to utilize his scrambles. It's not a question of is he going to get taken down. Merab is going to go for takedowns, and he's more than likely going to secure a good amount of those takedowns. But Cory is known for having some nice scrambles, getting back to his feet and keeping the fight where he wants it. But can he do that for 25 minutes? Can he do that for at least 3 rounds and survive the last two? I think Cory has a high fight IQ, and I don't think Merab is going to make easy work of him. I know Cory is going to have a smart game plan here, but I don't think he'll be able to keep up with the pressure and pace that Merab will put him throughout those 25 minutes. Merab is the cardio machine, and I think he's going to win for sure rounds 2, 3, and 4. Maybe the first round if he strikes a little bit, it can be like a feeling out process. But those middle rounds, it's really when he starts to pick up the pace. And round 5 might be of a chill round for Merab, after he already won the majority of the rounds. Kind of like how he looked in the 5th round with O'Malley. Even though Merab did get hurt in that final round, he survived and still won. Something similar can happen here, but the point is, he's going to win the majority of this fight. Rounds 2, 3, and 4. That's really when he's putting in the work. I just see Merab having relentless, high-paced, dominant wrestling, securing the takedowns over and over again. Cory getting tired and breaking down from scrambling so much. Using too much energy trying to get up to the point where if he does get up, he's trying to recover from getting up. He's trying to recover from using so much energy from getting up, right? And it really looks like Merab is he's having fun in there. It's like it's too easy for him. He's kissing O'Malley's neck. He's picking up Cejudo and walking to the other side of the octagon. He's talking to Umar in the middle of the fight. He's waving to the crowd and smiling. It just seems like he's not even trying. He's really just having fun in there. It looks like these guys really aren't on his level, and he knows that, right? The way I see this going is pretty much Cory is going to use his footwork, control the striking distance. Merab's going to play the striking game a little bit, throw a combination to close the distance and blast for a takedown, right? That's going to be the story of this fight. And Cory getting up after being ragdolled, Cory trying to recover only to have to scramble again and then getting taken down again. Maybe by some miracle we see Cory hit a flying knee like he did to Frankie Edgar. But I think Merab is too high level to get caught in anything like that. And for me, despite any stylistic matchup that Cory tries to bring to this fight, we've seen numerous amounts of styles against Merab, and they all have failed. And I don't think Cory is going to bring anything new to the table. I mean, beating O'Malley twice, it's truly a big deal. The sharp striking O'Malley has is really high level. And if that wasn't able to really phase Merab, I don't think Cory really has anything different than the rest of these guys. What? Are we going to see Cory out wrestle Merab? I don't think so. Merab has an endless gas tank. He's known for his chain wrestling, and his pace breaks down the elites of this division. And Cory, he has that crafty, rangy striking style. He has great scrambles, but this is going to be a defend all night type of fight. He's going to be defending to a point where he's breaking down. He's losing his energy, and he's not going to be able to implement his game plan because he's too busy defending. So that when he does have space and time to actually work, he's going to be trying to recover, only to get taken down again. So the volume of takedowns the volume of takedowns and control is going to be enough for Merab to win guaranteed rounds 2, 3, and 4. That's just guaranteed. So moving on to our next fight, we got the main event of the evening: Magomed Ankalaev versus Alex Pereira. I'm gonna go Magomed Ankalaev. It's the rematch we've all been waiting for. I'm going with Magomed. I feel that first fight was truly such an impressive performance to stand and strike with Alex, landing the better shots. Even wobbling Alex was something we've never seen before. Of course, we saw Adesanya knock out Alex, but Magomed was pretty much dominating the majority of the striking exchanges and mixing in the wrestling. Even though Magomed couldn't land a takedown, he was still winning. Pushing him up against the fence, getting his takedowns defended, goes back to striking and lands the better shots. That's called winning, whether we like it or not, right? And Alex was even able to land on Magomed with clean shots a few times, and it looked like it didn't even phase Magomed whatsoever. And Alex was saying that he wasn't fully healthy in that fight. So, for what it's worth, we got to give him the benefit of the doubt, sure. But that fight in general was just so telling uh, over Magomed's skills that I can't really see anything different happening in the rematch. So, I don't know what Alex is going to do in this fight. Like, what is he going to bring to the table? Like, is he going to out wrestle Magomed? No. Is he going to defend the takedowns? Yeah, he may defend those takedowns, but is he then going to be able to get his striking going? Probably not, because Magomed will probably just push him up against the fence. He's probably going to be busy defending those takedowns. And in the striking exchanges, obviously this is where Pereira has the greatest chance to victory, to land a nice clean shot and wobble Magomed and then get the finish. But the movement and skills that I was seeing in Magomed in that first fight, it was truly something special. People want to say that he got all his takedowns defended and he didn't deserve to win. But if you watch those striking exchanges, Magomed seriously has some high level striking. He wasn't afraid to engage. He had Pereira backing up in a lot of those moments. He just played it smart and didn't strike longer than he needed to. He used his striking to set up those attempted takedowns. Even though those takedowns weren't successful, it was still winning him the rounds after landing the better shots and then pretty much waiting for the round to be over. Right? Not to mention that Pereira is now 38 years old. Like, his prime years are past him, I would say. And Ankalaev is in his prime years right now. And I think there's going to be an athletic difference here. Because let's say Pereira does find success on the feet. Ankalaev is strong and durable enough to survive by just pushing Pereira up against the fence and stalling out the round to recover, then to get back to work, you know? I'll say Pereira, he didn't look himself in the first fight. He wasn't showing that fast twitch head movement and that godlike speed and reaction time. But I think Magomed had a lot to do with that. Magomed was disrupting his rhythm, using his own strikes. It was even looking like Magomed had the power advantage in that fight, which is crazy to say considering what Poatan has been doing to other fighters. I think Magomed is in his prime years right now, well-rounded enough on the feet and with the grappling, of course, to nullify Pereira's powerful left hooks. And we've seen it happen in the first fight. I'm not sure what changes Poatan can make in this rematch to find success. Ankalaev is in his prime right now. He's composed counter kickboxer and he has some great kicks. The clinch and wrestling threat is going to be too much for Alex to deal with. He might defend a majority of those takedowns, but how's he going to push him off him? Pereira's game is to stand up with him. He has he has GOAT tier power and timing. His power is where his success lies, but Magomed knows that. And he's shown to have an answer for that, and Pereira is 38 years old. He can be stalled by just getting pushed up against the fence. And those takedown threats is really what disrupted his rhythm in that first fight, right? So I think Magomed's going to be mixing in the clinch threats with the cleaner shots on the feet. He'll most likely win a decision or probably find a late stoppage here, because he said in the build up to this fight, it's not a chance for Pereira to redeem himself. It's a chance for me to finish this fight. I believe Magomed when he says things like that. I can see Magomed putting a stamp on this fight. So that would be big if that happens, if he finishes Pereira. But ultimately, I'm going Magomed to win a decision here. And that concludes my picks for this week's UFC card. Let me know what you guys thought. Let me know who you're rolling with. Drop your predictions down below. Let me know if you agree or disagree with my picks, or if you thought they were horrible. I'd love to see what y'all thought. You know, last week we went 11-1. We had such a great week. Hopefully we can do the same thing this week. As always, I hope you're doing well. Hope you guys have a great day. I love you guys. That's it for me. I'm out. Peace.